Speaker. I am honoured to open the debate on such an important issue for Canadians and for global security. It is right that all sides of this House have the opportunity to make their voice heard. That's why I travelled to Iraq with opposition critics last month. That's why we called the committee back early, before Parliament was sitting, to discuss the deployment of military advisors. That's why the government supported an emergency debate on the second day of this parliamentary session. And that's why we have tabled this motion to debate a new phase of operations. There are significant questions, not just of process, but of principle, at stake here in the House today. So let us focus on the issues at hand with the seriousness that Canadians rightly expect. I will defer to my colleagues on some of the details of different aspects. The Minister of National Defence will speak to the military mission. But let me be very upfront about the key facts off the top. How long this operation will last? 6 months. How many CF-18s? 6. How many other planes? 1 refueling aircraft, 2 surveillance aircraft. How many supporting crew members in a neighbouring country? 600. Because we are asking our brave men and women to fly over the skies of Iraq and confront a new generation of terrorism, a terrorist threat that has directly targeted our country. I hope we can draw a line under debating the debate. The government has agreed on its intention. The Prime Minister has articulated clearly the direction he intends to lead. How many military advisors? Up to 69, aiding and advising those who will confront ISIL forces. The motion before the House is very clear about what we're doing, and it is just as clear about what we're not doing. It also sets out the clear purpose of the mission. At every step of the way, I've wanted Canada to show a strong and united front in the fight against ISIL. It saddens me that it appears that this will not happen. I think it is fair to say that all sides of the House have, at times, been known to produce more heat than light. But this issue is much bigger than that. This House is bigger than that. And, Mr. Speaker, Canada is bigger than that. We have heard those words in this chamber before, that a big country doesn't need small thinking, that we must think big for who we are and what the promise of our people holds for the future. As a former distinguished member of this House, Bob Rae, said, this is not about peace versus war. This is about the collective capacity of governments and international institutions to deal effectively with the perpetrators of violence. By now, everyone is familiar with ISIL's brutal methods. This is not just another conflict. The struggle is not against a state or even a foreign dictator. This is a struggle against a group of terrorists that rape and pillage and slaughter anything and anyone that stands in their way. These terrorists are creating a proto-state, a place where they can train for attacks against Canada and the West, where brave and idealistic people like Alan Henning are beheaded on camera, a humanitarian worker, where women and girls are auctioned in slave markets, where the heads of minorities are mounted on spikes in town squares, where the medieval arrogantly confronts the civilized. On Friday, I read an account from a shopkeeper in the Kurdish town of Mulcair. We had to leave, he said. We were so nervous because everybody knew that ISIL had killed everyone they found in some small towns. Those people claim to be Muslims, but they have no religion except killing. That is their belief. With the support from airstrikes by the Obama administration, this man's town was recently taken back from ISIL's grip. He then said, I know all about what Canada's doing. It'll be very good what the Canadians will soon do in Iraq. This supportive message has been echoed by my counterpart in the Kurdish regional government. Nous ne pouvons prédire l'avenir.
We cannot predict the future, but we can be conscious of the current situation. Just 3 years ago, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was dealt with, and now their successor is controlling a lot of area and a lot of resources, creating conditions for launching sophisticated attacks outside of the country. Last weekend, we heard of a pact between the Taliban in Pakistan and ISIL. We must attack this pact, and with reason. The new government has clearly asked that we come and help them.
Our government recognizes the multi-pronged nature of this crisis. As we attempt to halt ISIL's advance, no one has read the many stories or heard some of the stories for themselves in Iraq, can forget about the human cost of their merciless march. The scale of the humanitarian crisis is truly hard to comprehend. To get a sense of the scale of this human tragedy, imagine if more than the entire population of Montreal, every single Montrealer, had to flee their home in terror. That's 1.8 million people. That's women, children, and the elderly, and targeted religious minorities. Canada has been quick to respond to this unfolding crisis with practical support. We are already the 7th biggest donor in the world, and the head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq has praised Canada's cooperation. I would like to focus on one element of this challenge today, one that has had far too little attention so far. As a new report by the United Nations has described, ISIL's brutality is matched only by its depravity. In one case over the summer, they herded up 150 women and girls, mostly Christians and Yazidis, and sent them to Syria to be given to ISIL fighters, either as a reward or to be sold as sex slaves. Iraqi forces capturing towns from ISIL have reported finding naked women tied to trees. Sexual violence and conflict is a despicable crime that targets the most vulnerable. This is an issue that Canada has been taking a lead role in and will continue to in the upcoming weeks and months. We must ensure that the women and girls who suffer at the hands of ISIL are never far from our minds. We will ensure that their protection is central to the efforts of the United Nations and G7 through initiatives on women, peace, and security. Canada will support a specialized expert on sexual violence against women to be part of the Human Rights Council's mission to Iraq. And I can announce today that we will contribute up to $5 million to help victims of sexual violence in Iraq get the assistance and the treatment that they need. We will contribute another $5 million to partners, including Justice Rapid Response, a Canadian-created initiative to investigate and prosecute crimes of sexual violence in ISIL-held territory. We are also partnering with the United Kingdom Foreign and Commonwealth Office and my former colleague William Hague, who has taken up this important cause, to find ways of taking this commitment further on the ground. And this is something that I have personally worked on in recent years. When you look at a humanitarian crisis of this size, there is always more that can be done. But I think we can all be proud of how much Canada is doing in this regard. That said, we must be careful not to draw a line between security and humanitarian assistance. That is not a false distinction. It is a dangerous one. It is not either or. Sending someone a doctor, lawyer, or aid worker is great, but it's not going to stop people they're trying to help from getting slaughtered in the first place, and from this humanitarian crisis growing. When your house is on fire, you have to call the firefighters as well as an ambulance. Major Mariam al-Mansouri knows this. She is a fighter pilot for the United Arab Emirates, helping to strike against the same terrorists who are raping and murdering countless other women. Ultimately, this comes down to what kind of nation we see ourselves as. And, as the recent beheadings have reminded us, we cannot stand by as international humanitarian workers are themselves at risk of being slaughtered. You cannot confront a network of death, as President Obama calls it, solely armed with bandages, platitudes, and investigations. Do we stand with close allies like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, nations like Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands, Arab friends like Jordan and the United Arab Emirates? Or do we stand aside as they put themselves in the line? Mr. Speaker, Canada is better than that. As I have repeatedly said, I believe the fight against terrorism is the struggle that will define our generation. That doesn't mean this mission will last a generation, as one of my friends opposite has said. But I believe we will be judged in future by whether we took on this fight or ducked it. Just think for a moment what could happen if we don't act. When I sing, "We stand on guard for thee," and maybe I don't sing it very well, but I mean it well enough. I mean it as a citizen, and I mean it as a member of Parliament who sees this as the highest responsibility we have to our constituents. If we don't deal with ISIL and its ilk, they will deal with us. Anyone who accepts the premise that ISIL is a threat to our security while leaving the fight against ISIL to others is abrogating their moral responsibility and their duty of care.
That's right.
Now, if you are an out-and-about pacifist, I can respectfully disagree with that. But if you do believe that in the realities of this world, military actions is sometimes one of the necessary courses to take, then let's have a serious debate. I was glad to see that the House gave time for the member for Saanich Gulf Islands on Friday. Her argument was more principled than political, based on the belief that military action is wrong and counterproductive. That view may not be right, but it is sincere. Others seem to be grasping for any reason, though, not to support Canada's mission. Some in this House have questioned what our most elite soldiers could possibly teach Iraqi or Kurdish forces. They have questioned the effectiveness and honour of the Royal Canadian Air Force. They have deflected by pointing at other concerning situations in the world. At the end of the day, we know that pedantry is easier than principle. It's easy to make excuses than to take responsibilities. And it's easier to criticize the risks of action if you are not held accountable for the risks of inaction. But any government or aspiring government should be held to a higher standard than that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe Canada should be held to a higher standard than that. To quote, "Leadership is not about making the easy decision that goes along with things. It's about taking a stand with our values and our principles." That was not the Prime Minister. It was my friend, the leader of the Liberal Party, who said those words a week ago. And I invite members of his party to reflect on them today. The member for Papineau likes to talk authoritatively about the way Canada is supposed to do things. Well, Mr. Speaker, throughout history, my Canada has done its part in defending the ideals and values that have made our country the envy of the world. My Canada heeds the call. My Canada protects the vulnerable. It challenges the aggressor. My Canada doesn't leave all the heavy lifting to others. We pick up our tools and we get on with what needs to be done. There was a time when the Liberal Party believed in that. Mr. Speaker, the dark clouds of terror are gathering in Iraq and Syria, threatening to strike the thunder from India to Spain. We must not let this storm descend on Canada, and we know that it will left unchecked. When terrorism is thrust upon us, we must be strong in its face and repudiate it with every ounce of our ability. These terrorists stretch their delusional fantasies across generations and across borders. I urge us to come together in solidarity with those who are being victimized and brutalized, to come together in solidarity with those who are standing up against this terrible, barbaric threat. As you consider whether to support this motion or not, I encourage all members to ask yourself, what would you say to that Kurdish shopkeeper? What would you say to the women and girls fearing that ISIL will come for them next? What would you say to that fighter pilot looking for a wingman? So yes, let's debate what needs to be done, but let's be Parliament at its best. Let's be Canada at its best. Mr. Speaker, I encourage and urge all members to support this motion before the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin the prepared remarks on the government motion today to send our fighter jets and military personnel into this mission in Iraq, I'd like to go back over some of the comments made by the minister who just spoke.
Reminding my friend that although his answer to my colleague, our critic in defense, was artful, it was not accurate. He said on the air this weekend that there was a United Nations resolution that unanimously allowed for this mission. That is simply false. There is no such resolution. You can read it in its entirety. It's quite long. The preamble is very long. It sets things out. It is simply not true that this is a United Nations mission. Now, the minister is far too intelligent and far too experienced to know that. He said that on the air, and people will be able to check the record of what he said and compare it to what he just said again here today. The other thing is, Mr. Speaker, in his remarks earlier, he claimed that the government had articulated clearly the reasons for this mission, the end game, what it's supposed to be about. That is not true. And I'll point that out, citing chapter and verse of the different versions, the alternating versions that we've received from this government. One of the most shocking things in last week's speech here in the House, Friday's speech by the Prime Minister, and I'm anxious to hear the Prime Minister today. It's always important to hear his Foreign Minister, but the Prime Minister, of course, should be front and center in this debate, and I'm anxious to hear it. In describing ISIL, the Minister said the reason that they're going to go after this group is that they rape, pillage, and slaughter. Now, no one is underestimating the horrors that we've seen. And in this day and age, they come instantaneously either to your TV screen or through other media. But, Mr. Speaker, contrast that with what was in the Prime Minister's speech verbatim Friday, repeated just now by the Foreign Minister. Foreign Minister said that his government is no friend of Assad. I'm more than willing to take the Foreign Minister at his word. But actions speak louder than words. So what the Prime Minister did say in his speech on Friday is that if there was a request from Assad to bomb in Syria, that he would follow that request. Now, what that means in real simple terms that every Canadian can understand is that the Prime Minister of Canada is according a great deal of credibility to Bashar al-Assad and his murderous, genocidal regime. We give them no such credibility on this side of the House. How can you indeed, on the one hand, claim that the Assad regime is not even worth talking to, and then on the other hand say, but when they ask us, we're going to respond to the request? They're mutually exclusive. And it shows a total lack of structure in the thinking of this government. It also shows a lack of rigorous thought. It shows a lack frankly, of ethics on the international stage. We've also heard the minister say a little bit earlier that you cannot deliver humanitarian aid unless you're involved in the combat mission itself, in the bombing. Look at the countries that are indeed close to us, many of whom the government likes to cite, but who are not involved in any combat mission. Italy, Germany, Norway, all close NATO allies, all involved in providing aid, all rejecting airstrikes, as Canada should reject airstrikes. Now, the minister said as well that people are grasping for any reason. What a haughty and dismissive way to deal with people who just don't agree with him. That bombing, more bombing, is a way to peace in a region that has already seen too much war. We respectfully disagree with the government on this. Thoughtful editorial comment across the country has said just the opposite. I'm only going to read two, but they're well worth reading. I'm going to read Agnès Gruda from La Presse of Saturday, the 4th of October, first. Then I'll read Peggy Mason, who just yesterday, Sunday, October 5th, wrote a very thoughtful piece in the Ottawa Citizen. What's important to know is that Peggy Mason is Canada's former United Nations ambassador for disarmament, and she was an advisor to the then Conservative External Affairs Minister, Joe Clark. The minister throws out the word progressive as if it were a slur. Yes, she was a progressive conservative. Agnès Gruda, La Presse.
Agnès Gruda, La Presse, October 4th, 2014. Entitled, A War Off to a Bad Start. Australia has done it. France, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. A dozen countries have already agreed to participate in airstrikes. American airstrikes, not the UN, American, against ISIL, in Syria and in Iraq. And Canada will be joining them next week. The debate on this military engagement brings back bad memories. The war against Saddam Hussein, in which Canada had the excellent idea of not participating. But Iraq of 2014 is different from Iraq of 2003. This time, we're not facing an imaginary threat. Since he took over the second largest city, Mosul, the country has had it, and its leader have had time to show what they're all about. A report produced on Thursday has talked about what has been done to the civilians, the collective rape, executions, kidnapping, public hangings. The members of IS have no scruples. Jihadists are threatening the territory. And this battle is moving towards the border with Turkey. So yes, there are excellent reasons for wanting to stop this bloodshed, including, if need be, an international air effort, but not a full-out offensive. But the operation in which the UN's, or the United States rather, has committed itself is just that. In parentheses, strikes to date have had a negative impact. According to Robert Blecher, who is an analyst at the International Crisis Group, he has stated that we're committing mistakes made in the past. One of the main risks of this offensive is that it might well alienate people, the very people we are trying to save. Islamists. Robert Blacher has mentioned a village in Syria that was bombed one day by the American army and the next day by the Assad regime. On the ground, it's very difficult to understand where precisely the missiles are coming from, said Mr. Bashir, and it's also very difficult to explain the dominant rebel groups why Assad himself has not been bombed. Those among the rebels who have Western tendencies end up being under the impression that they are simply fighting for the regime, and the civilians are simply feel like they're in the way of those who are bombing the Sunnis rather. And politically, this creates a very difficult situation, according to this expert. What's more, we need to look at what the objective is. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. bombed a brigade affiliated with another group of jihadist fighters, Al-Nusra. That group is fighting on 2 fronts, against Bashar al-Assad and against its enemy, ISIL. Now, we assisted or helped the bad guys. We want to stop, and that's quite a paradox. Thank you very much. Now let's get back to Iraq. There again, the line between the good guys and the bad guys is not all that easy to see. According to a report from the UN, the Iraqi army and the Shiites are not involved in the same way, and the consequences will be different. Namely, this will result in radicalizing people we are attempting to protect, and they will be in utter confusion. No one knows what strategy is being undertaken by the coalition, according to Der Spiegel in Germany, in a long analysis it published. With the current approach, rather, it raises more questions and no answers. Are we fighting ISIL or all Islamist groups, including the ones on the al-Nusra front? And how can we avoid helping Assad and alienating these Syrian rebels? Is there a strategy, a political strategy for the end of war period for Iraq and Syria? And when local support is provided for this offensive, without which, in fact, it will be doomed to fail. ISIL appeared in Iraq in the early 2000s, and local Sunni tribes contained it. If it is expanding this year, it's because the same groups no longer have trust in the Sunni or the Shiite in Iraq, in Baghdad. So perhaps there needs to be a solution for the Sunni in Syria and in Iraq, according to the same expert. There are still some Sunni rebels who could join forces with the international community. However, in its current form, the war against ISIL might well convert those potential Western allies into enemies.
With all of these different layers of confessions from these tribes and these fratricide wars, the situation in Iraq and Syria is extremely complex. To put things simply, yes, it can be fought with weapons, but this war is off to a bad start, and nothing in the Prime Minister's speech shows that we can realign things. So that is one commentary by Agnès Gruda in La Presse on Saturday. Now for Peggy Mason in the Ottawa Citizen on the weekend. In fact, just yesterday, do not forget that she was the former ambassador for Canada to the United Nations, specifically responsible for disarmament, and that she was special advisor of the former External Affairs Minister with the Progressive Conservatives, Joe Clark.
Harper's Iraq plan, the Prime Minister's Iraq plan may make matters worse, says former ambassador. The Prime Minister will put Canada's proposed combat military mission in Iraq to a vote on Monday, today. Recent polls have suggested that Canadians slightly favour the bombing mission to confront the threat posed by the extremist organization, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. It comes as no surprise that Canadians want to help and do something. But Harper's plan to send Canadian warplanes to join the but the Prime Minister's plan to send Canadian warplanes, I'll try to make that editing change on the fly, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading an editorial where his name is used. I'll try to always substitute Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister's plan to send Canadian warplanes to join the U.S.-led coalition's bombing of Iraq may just make matters worse. The Prime Minister and his allies are underestimating their opponents as a bunch of religious extremists bent on spreading wanton mayhem and terror. Islamic State may be brutally ruthless, but they know exactly what they are doing. Their core is made up of seasoned, motivated fighters and an extremely experienced leadership that go back to the, quote, dirty war waged by the American and British Special Forces in Iraq between 2006 and 2009. ISIL is playing a strategical game of chess with its every move, while the West is playing military tic-tac-toe. ISIL is not just a military organization, it is a political movement with a well-thought-out ideology, however abhorrent it may be to the West. It governs the huge areas it controls in Iraq and Syria. Ruthless in eliminating any potential opponents, it also provides electricity, food, and other vital services for ordinary people in the areas it controls. That is why American airstrikes against ISIL recently targeted not only oil and gas facilities, but also grain elevators, a highly problematic course of action in both legal and humanitarian terms, particularly if the conflict is to be a long one. To date, Western military action has been disastrously counterproductive. The Prime Minister says, quote, "We are not responsible for the chaos in Libya, yet it is absolutely clear that the NATO-led military victory in Libya was a Pyrrhic one which paved the way for the civil war that followed." We have to remember how we got to this point. Time and again in the past, we have chosen war over negotiations. Look at the lessons of Libya. Had we not exceeded the UN mandate in Libya, which excluded regime change, we could have negotiated a power-sharing deal that would have promoted incremental democratic reform and not left a power vacuum to be filled by extremists, including ISIL. Exactly the same lesson can be learned from Syria. Had the West not insisted on Assad's immediate departure and refused to allow Iran a seat at the table, Kofi Annan's power-sharing arrangement within a transitional government would have paved the way for incremental democratic reform in Syria and once again would have left much less room for extremists like ISIL to operate. A UN mandate privileging inclusive governance and democratic reforms in concert with robust military support has been central to recent progress in Somalia and Mali. A UN mandate is also possible for effective intervention in Iraq and Syria if all necessary players, including Russia and Iran, are brought fully into the negotiations, and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states are at the core of the political strategy, not just token participants. A comprehensive, broadly supported, and UN-mandated approach is long overdue in the heretofore disastrously counterproductive war on terror. Let this enlightened approach be the basis for Canadian action in Iraq and Syria. As I said, Mr. Speaker, that is from Peggy Mason, Canada's former UN ambassador for disarmament and advisor to then Progressive Conservative External Affairs Minister Joe Clark. Monsieur le Président, il y a 12 ans.
Mr. Speaker, 12 years ago, the Government of Canada undertook a mission to rebuild Afghanistan, a country that had been ravaged by war that had begun in 1979 with the invasion of the former Soviet Union. The objective was to bring stability and safety to the new government in Kabul. As the years passed, the Liberal government radically transformed this mission, which what was supposed to be a mission of rebuilding became a combat mission. The arrival of the Conservatives to head the government did not change that. On the contrary, the mission and the war continued. A handful of special forces in a mission that was very limited in time became 40,000 Canadian soldiers. In the longest combat mission that Canada has ever seen, and a minimum of $30 billion was spent out of our public coffers. 160 people died, thousands more were injured, and some people that we tend to forget, thousands of men and women who returned with psychological scars due to post-traumatic stress disorder. Canadian forces were very far away from the original rebuilding mission that was first and foremost, that had first and foremost become combat. And what is interesting, and you know because you were there as well, Mr. Speaker, despite the vicious attacks on him, Jack Layton had the courage to do what was right and to say what needed to be said.
To the Conservative Minister of Defense at the time. It was then the member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills, who was the minister. And here are key questions that he, the former minister, might remember Jack asking him. What are the goals and objectives of this mission? How do they meet Canada's foreign policy objectives? What is the realistic mandate of the mission and how's it being enforced? What are the criteria that we will be using to measure progress? What is the definition of success? Sound familiar? Of course it does. Those are the same questions the NDP are asking today about the deployment in Iraq. In fact, the very same questions were asked about the mission in Afghanistan to the Liberal government just a few months before the Conservative member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills, with good reasons. These questions are legitimate and Canadians deserve answers.
The NDP also forced the holding of a debate and a vote in the House of Commons. At the time, the Prime Minister was able to extend the mission in Afghanistan thanks to the support of Liberal members. The NDP members spoke out against this, and I am still very, very proud of them for having done so.
Now, Mr. Speaker, even if we have not always agreed, there is, in fact, a proud tradition here in Canada and in this House of working together, respectfully, on issues of war and peace. In 1991, for example, NDP leader Audrey McLaughlin was sworn into the Privy Council so that she could receive classified information on the First Gulf War. The same courtesy was extended to Bill Blakey and the Prime Minister himself at the beginning of the Liberal engagement in Afghanistan. And later, that was extended to Jack Layton as well. And it is only fair to say that the Prime Minister continued this tradition at first. The Prime Minister briefed Jack Layton on our mission in Libya, and he briefed me on our mission to Mali. Yet now, as the Prime Minister takes Canada to war in Iraq, silence. Worse yet, Conservatives have gone out of their way to stifle informed debate. The Prime Minister, with the support of the Liberals, launched us into the war in Iraq with what he claimed was a 30-day non-combat mission. He promised Canada's involvement would be, quote, re-evaluated at the end of this first deployment. On September 15th, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence said there were already 69 Canadian soldiers on the ground. On September 26th, the Prime Minister himself claimed there were, quote, several dozen Canadian Forces personnel in Iraq. But according to Radio-Canada, these claims were false. The first 26 Canadian forces did not arrive in Iraq until 23 days into the 30-day mission. The Prime Minister did not deny that when I asked him the question specifically in this House last week. Mr. Speaker, how can you evaluate a mission when troops have been on the ground for only a week? Sounds disingenuous. The promise that Canadian involvement in Iraq would be re-evaluated after a month, frankly, was just that, disingenuous, if not a sham. A 30-day mission to get Canada into this war without a debate or a vote in Parliament, setting the stage for this escalation. And the lack of clear and honest information from this government only continues. The Minister of Foreign Affairs refuses to state where Canadian aircraft will be based. He said it's an operational detail he's not prepared to discuss. But other countries have been told where their forces are stationed. For that matter, Canada has always revealed where our aircraft have been based in past conflicts. Why the refusal to provide this information now? The Minister of Foreign Affairs also insists in one breath that Canadian forces will be under the command of the Chief of the Defence Staff of our country, but he says in the next interview that they will be, quote, working under the leadership of the United States. What is that supposed to mean? And just as the Prime Minister has refused to provide clear information about the mission, he's been unable to clearly explain the mission's goals. We're a long way from the boast of the Minister at the beginning of his remarks today. On September 30th, when asked how he would define victory in Iraq, the Prime Minister said that ISIS was planning attacks, quote, against large populations in the region and, quote, against this country, Canada. He said Canada would, quote, work with our allies on a counter-terrorism operation to get us to the point where this organization does not have the capacity to launch those kinds of attacks. It's one mission. But in his speech to the House last Friday, the Prime Minister was already walking back that description of his goals. Now, he said, we needed only to, quote, degrade the capabilities of ISIL, specifically their ability to conduct large-scale military movements and operate in the open. This weekend, the Foreign Minister lowered expectations even further, saying that if they could, quote, contain this problem, stop it growing, that alone would be a, quote, significant accomplishment. Inaccurate information, shifting definitions of success. These have been the hallmarks of the American war in Iraq since the invasion began. Remember, the United States has been in this conflict for over 10 years. It has been fighting ISIS under one name or another for over 10 years. While ISIS has renamed itself several times since 2004, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Mujahideen Shura Council, the Islamic State of Iraq, and Al-Sham, Syria, it is literally the same insurgent group that U.S. forces have been battling for over a decade. Why does the Prime Minister think that he can use military force to accomplish what others have been trying unsuccessfully to do since 2003? The Prime Minister has twice insisted in this House that the mission will not become a, quote, quagmire. It's his word, and he keeps using it over and over again. It won't be a quagmire. When the Prime Minister is throwing around the word quagmire multiple times when this mission has barely begun, let me be honest, Mr. Speaker, we don't think it bodes very well. This weekend on West Block with Tom Clark, the Foreign Affairs Minister was already contemplating returning to the House of Commons for another extension after the next 6 months, planning for the next escalation before this one has even begun, before it's even been voted on in Parliament. To quote Robert Fowler, Canada's longest-serving ambassador to the UN and advisor to 3 prime ministers on foreign policy, our coalition's mission will inevitably creep. We will bomb ever more. Predators will hunt more widely and more indiscriminately. We will kill and maim many, many more innocent civilians than the caliphate could behead in its wildest dreams. In fact, the Prime Minister has already acknowledged he is prepared to extend the bombing to Syria. What's more, the Prime Minister has even set the bizarre and distasteful standard that he will launch airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria if asked to do so by the regime of brutal dictator Bashar Assad. The list of Assad's own atrocities is almost unspeakable, and that's why we find it so reprehensible that the Prime Minister would give him any credibility at all, much less a voice in determining what our brave women and men in uniform do to defend our country. Let's look at a list of those atrocities from official sites. Assad's attacks are ongoing. The United Nations has noted 29 massacres by forces loyal to Assad in 2014 alone. Use of chemical weapons. The attack in the Ghouta area of Damascus is the most significant confirmed use of chemical weapons against civilians since 1988, and the worst use of weapons of mass destruction in the 21st century. The United States estimates that just under 1,500 civilians were killed. Indiscriminate use of barrel bombs. Syrian government forces have dropped barrel bombs on civilian areas, including hospitals and schools, with devastating results. Barrel bomb attacks have included some believed to contain the chemical agent chlorine in 8 incidents in April 2014. Targeting of civilians by sniper, including children and pregnant women. Targeting of doctors, nurses, paramedics, hospitals, ambulances, and pharmacies for attacks. Systematic torture and deaths of detainees. As many as 11,000 people in jails have been killed between March 2011 and August 2013. Assad's forces systematically arrest wounded patients in state hospitals to interrogate them, often using torture, about their supposed participation in opposition demonstrations or armed activities. Summary executions and extrajudicial killings, including the massacre at Ghouta, where over 100 civilians were killed, half of them children. Entire families were shot dead in their homes. Sexual violence against women, men, and children in detention to degrade and humiliate detainees. Sexual assault of women and children during home raids and ground operations. Use of starvation as a weapon of war, with at least 128 civilians starved to death in a besieged refugee camp near Damascus in 2014. 60% of the camp, housing 18,000 to 20,000 civilians, suffered from malnourishment as of the spring of this year. In his speech in this House on Friday, Prime Minister of Canada said that if the person responsible for those atrocities makes the request, he, the Prime Minister of Canada, will answer positively. We find that shameful. This is among the many reasons that so many of our allies have expressed concern with so many elements of this mission. This mission has no mandate from the UN, no mandate from NATO. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have listed some of our traditional allies that are participating: Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Denmark. But Britain and Denmark refuse to engage in bombing in Syria, even if Bashar al-Assad asks them. Italy and Germany have rejected any involvement in the combat mission altogether. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has tried to cover for the serious questions being raised about this mission. He claimed this weekend, and I quote, "The UN Security Council has been seized with this issue and has passed a resolution unanimously with respect to the operation in Iraq." That statement is outright and unquestionably false, Mr. Speaker. To quote just one source, it's actually worth reading the resolution because it's quite long. But the New York Times on September 27th simply said this: the UN Security Council resolution on Iraq and Syria does not authorize military action by any country, quote, unquote. That's everyone's analysis. You know why? Because that's what's in the UN Security Council resolution. You cannot make it say something that it does not say. There is, Mr. Speaker, overwhelming agreement here at home and abroad about the need to confront the horrors perpetrated by ISIS. But there is no agreement that Western military force is the answer. Nearly 3 weeks ago, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz was already reporting that ISIS had recruited more than 6,000 new fighters since the United States began its airstrikes in August. At least 1,300 of these fighters come from abroad. Alexander Panetta of the Canadian Press reports that, quote, the London-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports that 5 civilians were killed in airstrikes on oil refineries, 2 workers were killed in a Manbij grain mill, and 6 male civilians were killed in the southern countryside at Al-Hasaka. The group says it's aware of at least 73 people joining ISIL in the Aleppo area in the wake of the first US-led airstrikes. Peggy Mason, whom I quoted earlier at length, former UN ambassador for disarmament, had this to say: the Prime Minister and his allies are underestimating their opponents as a bunch of religious extremists bent on spreading wanton mayhem and terror. ISIS is playing a strategic game of chess with its every move, while the West is playing military tic-tac-toe. To date, Western military action has been disastrously counterproductive. Robert Fowler, as I said, our longest-serving ambassador to the UN, who has indeed advised 3 prime ministers, had this to say: ISIS knows the propaganda value of poking sticks into American eyes or knives into Western throats. They know full well that ill-informed and poorly executed Western forays into, quote, Muslim lands has been disastrous for us, and they are anxious to lure us into further folly. They are confident that by so doing they will dramatically increase their recruiting base, their authority, and the scope and impact of their movement, and they simply do not give a damn about the numbers they will lose in the process. Truly, in their eyes, such losses are a blessing. We have, in other words, responded in precisely the way they counted on us to do so. In Der Spiegel, on peut lire ceci.
We can read the following: no one knows what is the strategy that the coalition is following. And that's what Der Spiegel said in a long analysis. According to an international analyst, politically, strikes will have a negative impact on the ground, and it's very difficult to understand where the missiles are coming from, and it's very hard to explain to the dominant rebel groups why Assad is not being bombed. Politically, this creates a very difficult situation.
But military force is not our only option. New Democrats have called on the government to dramatically increase humanitarian aid in Iraq, which at last count stands at just $28 million. Although I will say, Mr. Speaker, I was very happy to hear that there was an announcement that we had been calling for a specific sum. $5 million was mentioned for victims of sexual violence, and that is a good thing that the government has announced today. And we wanted to just say that clearly on the record, that we congratulate the government for that part of their announcement today. In one of the government's few actions to cooperate with other parties here in the House, the Foreign Affairs Minister brought his counterparts in the opposition to Iraq. It was humanitarian aid, not airstrikes, that leaders on the ground requested. We can also help forces in the region to build the capacity to confront ISIS themselves. Canada is already aiding in the shipment of weapons to Kurdish Iraqi forces. We agree with that. That is the gist of the United Nations Security Council resolution. Give the Iraqis the ability to defend themselves. It should be a priority for Canada to determine exactly which groups can be trusted with such aid. Ultimately, the solution to this tragic conflict will come from those in the region, and the international community as a whole, not simply the West. And there, Canada's phenomenal diplomats can play a key role. Allow me to once again quote Peggy Mason, former UN Ambassador for Disarmament. We have to remember how we got to this point. Time and again in the past, we have chosen war over negotiations. A UN mandate privileging inclusive governance and democratic reforms in concert with robust military support has been central to recent progress in Somalia and Mali. A UN mandate is also possible for effective intervention in Iraq and Syria if all necessary players, including Russia and Iran, are brought fully into the negotiations, and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states are at the core of the political strategy, not just token participants. A comprehensive, broadly supported and UN-mandated approach is long overdue in the heretofore disastrously counterproductive war on terror. Let this enlightening approach be the basis for Canadian action in Iraq and Syria. Encore selon Robert Baird.
Once again, according to Robert Baird, to counter this threat, we need to offer a political solution to Sunnis and to Syrians.
Syria, precisely because those countries lack stable, well-functioning governments capable of maintaining peace and security within their own borders. Canada's first contribution should be to use every diplomatic, humanitarian, and financial resource at our disposal to respond to the overwhelming human tragedy unfolding on the ground and to strengthen political institutions in both those countries. With the well-deserved credibility Canada earned by rejecting the initial ill-advised invasion of Iraq, we are in a position to take on that task. The tragedy in Iraq and Syria will not end with another Western-led invasion in that region. It will end by helping the people of Iraq and Syria to build the political institutions and security capabilities they need to oppose these threats themselves. It's for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, that I move, seconded by the member for Ottawa Centre, that Government Business Number 13 be amended, A, by deleting clause III and replacing it with the following: except that, unless confronted with strong and direct force from capable and enabled local forces, the threat ISIL poses to international peace and security, including to Canadian communities, will continue to grow.
B, by deleting all the words after accordingly and by substituting the following: ask the government to participate in the fight against ISIL and offer military support in terms of weapons transport for a period going as long as 3 months. B, ask the government to reinforce humanitarian aid activities in areas where it can have an immediate impact and save lives. For example, constructing winterized refugee camps, investing in drinking water, medical and hygiene facilities, healthcare, and education for those who have been displaced by the combat. Ask the government to offer help in investigating and prosecuting war crimes. Ask the government to not deploy the Canadian forces in combat missions.
The government to seek House approval for any extension of the mission or any involvement of Canadian forces in Syria. Call on the government to report back on the costs of the mission on a monthly basis to the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs, and continue to offer its resolute and wholehearted support to the brave men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who stand on guard for all of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be sharing my time today with the member for Vancouver Quadra. The issue that we are debating today is this: should we send our service members into Iraq for a combat mission? As members of Parliament, it's our duty to conduct in-depth analysis of the issues before us and before we make an enlightened decision on this issue. The consequences of our decision will be huge and long-lasting. We are talking about going to war. I don't need to tell you that the 300 members of this House will live with the consequences of the decision we will vote on shortly.
That there are many points in the government's motion with which the Liberal Party agrees. The evil that is ISIL, the need for a broad coalition to take on ISIL, the need to provide far greater humanitarian assistance to the million-plus victims displaced by the advance of ISIL, the need for Canada to contribute to the coalition. No party can claim the high ground in condemning ISIL. We all forcefully condemn this abhorrent, barbaric group of terrorists. None of that is open to question. The question is, what should Canada do in order to contribute in the best possible manner to the collective effort to defeat ISIL? When that question is posed, there is a fundamental and consequential second question that follows. Should we contribute to a combat or a non-combat mission? That's what we're debating today. Let me say from the outset, the Prime Minister has failed to make a clear case for a Canadian combat role in Iraq at this time. The Prime Minister is taking us across the Rubicon by deciding on a combat mission. Once a country makes that decision, there is no turning back the clock.
When the government announced the initial mission in Iraq, the sending in of special forces to advise and train Kurdish forces, my party gave its support. We acknowledged the need to do something to help Iraq. We believe in the responsibility to protect doctrine, which recognizes a number of different ways that a country can contribute beyond a combat mission to protect the citizens of another country. Having visited the Kurdish region of Iraq in early September, I got an idea of the complex nature of the military challenge, as well as the scope of the human disaster, the humanitarian disaster. Canada cannot stand by and do nothing. We must contribute. We need to provide more than the $29 million in humanitarian assistance. We need to provide other assistance as well, and I'm happy to hear the announcement this morning. But this leads us to the contribution that the Prime Minister announced last Friday.
18 strike aircraft is the centerpiece of our contribution, thereby opting for a Canadian combat role. This leads to the obvious question: has the Canadian mission been clearly and fully defined? The answer is no. Defining a mission is much more than stating what assets we will contribute and then establishing a deadline. Going to war is an extraordinarily complex undertaking. You have to think it through. Let me give you an example. When George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, he only thought out step one, which was to capture Baghdad. After that, what? Well, we saw what happened because of the failure to understand the overall challenge. At this moment, the United States will lead in this coalition effort, and it's still working out an overall coalition strategy to defeat ISIL. This is the job given to General Allen. It's an extremely complex undertaking which rests on the assumption that Iraqi forces must eventually dislodge and defeat ISIL in a ground campaign. Should Canada be rushing in with an air combat mission? The answer is no. In the end, when you're talking about a combat role, getting in seems very straightforward. Getting out is much less so. The right approach is certainly not to say that Canada will go into Iraq with strike aircraft but may pull out in 6 months. The right approach is to give the most careful consideration to our objectives before we send our men and women into harm's way. That has not been done by this government. But there is something that we can do at this time. There are significant, substantial, non-combat roles that Canada can play. And to suggest that unless you are contributing to a combat role that your contribution has no value is offensive to me. There are as many as 60 coalition partners in the coalition, and each has chosen to contribute in its own way to the defeat of ISIL, whether by providing weapons, base facilities, strategic airlift, humanitarian aid, surveillance and other intelligence, or advice and training. All this to say there are many different ways to contribute, and they are all important. Last Friday, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "When it comes to sharing the burden of military intervention, the sacrifice that counts lies in the willingness to take casualties. Being a free rider means that you are not taken seriously." End of quote. I really object to that comment. It implies that you are taking the easy way out if you choose to contribute to the war effort in other ways.
Did the Prime Minister really say last Friday that Canada would not be taken seriously if it contributed to the coalition in other ways other than an air combat mission? Are the majority of partners in the coalition less committed? Or, to use the Prime Minister's word, less noble, because they've chosen to contribute to defeating ISIL through other means?
That I also dispute the Prime Minister's assertion that airstrikes are the hard thing to do, and his implication, by extension, that other roles are easy or require less courage. It is hard work on the ground to train and advise forces, to help refugees, to provide medical aid, undertake air surveillance, provide strategic airlift, and provide humanitarian aid. While these tasks are not combat roles, they are still important tasks, many needing to be performed by our military. I would also challenge his assertion that we're somehow abandoning our allies if we opt out of airstrikes. Nobody has accused Canada of not pulling its weight in the past 20 years, or indeed during the entire period that we have been a country. Ultimately, defeating ISIL will only happen on the ground, and there are important non-combat contributions that Canada can make in this effort. Mr. Speaker, let me conclude. There is a clear line between non-combat and combat. If the Prime Minister wants to take us in Canada across that line, he must make the case to Canadians as to why. The Prime Minister has not given us reason to believe that once in combat, the government will be able to limit our role. Once you cross the line into combat, as the government is doing, it is no simple matter to cross back over. And we all know this conflict is likely to last a long time. Deciding in 6 months to pull out of combat could be very problematic for Canada, depending on the situation, and the pressure will be on us to remain. That is why the Liberal Party of Canada will not support the Prime Minister's motion to take on a combat role in Iraq. Saying we'll review in 6 months is not an exit strategy. We have the capabilities to meaningfully assist in a non-combat role, a well-defined international mission in Iraq.
There are other options, apart from the two extremes. The first one being that there is no military role, and the other that Canada should rush to lead the combat role without being aware of all of the consequences. Mr. Speaker, it is our duty to make the right decision when we vote on this mission. Thank you.